This is Dumb History for Sleep, a podcast where we tuck you in with tales of the slowest, strangest and most wonderfully uneventful conflicts from human history. The kind of history that isn't taught in schools, probably because nobody wants to admit it ever happened. I'm your host, the Dummy Historian. And tonight, we're travelling back to a time when two powerful nations nearly went to war, not for gold, not for glory, but for a pig. Yes, one pig. A slightly adventurous pig, with a taste for potatoes. So, if you're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, worrying about taxes, deadlines, or the meaning of life, stop. Let's instead ease into the fog of history and drift off to the sweet oink of international tension. Let's set the scene. The year is 1859. The world is changing. Abraham Lincoln hasn't yet become president. Queen Victoria is sitting on the British throne, sipping tea and not thinking at all about pigs. Steamships chug along oceans and telegraphs buzz slowly across continents. In the misty corner of the Pacific Northwest, there lies an island. It's called San Juan Island. Not much happens there. It's quiet, peaceful. Just green fields, coastal cliffs, the occasional eagle, and apparently some potatoes. Now imagine you're living on San Juan Island. It's the 1850s. No internet, no TikTok, just wind, potatoes, and your neighbours. And on this island, two kinds of settlers lived side by side. American farmers, like Lyman Cutler, who moved in, cleared land, and grew crops. British employees like Charles Griffin, who worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. They raised sheep, tended to farms, and kept pigs. And one of those pigs, he was special. Black Berkshire boar. Fat, happy, roaming free. Griffin didn't believe in fences. He said pigs should be free, natural, wild. One small problem though, this pig had a refined palate. He loved potatoes. Not just any potatoes. Lyman Cutler's potatoes. Imagine being Lyman. You've worked all spring, planting your little patch. It's your pride, your dinner. And every few days you step outside and see that same pig, trotting confidently into your field, snuffling and devouring your spuds. He tried warning Griffin, politely, firmly, but the pig kept coming. And one day, in a moment of 19th century frontier frustration, Lyman took out his rifle and shot the pig. One shot, one pig, one international incident. Griffin was less than pleased. "You shot my pig," he said. "It was eating my potatoes," said Lyman. Griffin demanded $100 in compensation. That's the equivalent of a few $1,000s today. Lyman said he'd pay $10. Negotiations collapsed faster than a potato souffle, so Griffin reported Lyman to British authorities. And British authorities threatened to arrest Lyman for destroying property. Now Lyman, probably not wanting to be dragged to a British prison cell over a pig, ran to the Americans. He asked for protection. And the US military said, sure, why not? Because who wouldn't want to get involved in a dramatic pig dispute? Enter Captain George Pickett. Yes, the same George Pickett who would later charge famously and unsuccessfully across Gettysburg in the US Civil War. But right now, he wasn't dealing with civil war. He was dealing with a potato war. Pickett landed on the island with 66 American soldiers. He raised an American flag. He declared the island US territory. Bold move, George. But Britain wasn't exactly going to ignore that. So they sent 3 warships, real warships, with real cannons. Now both sides were staring each other down, on an island barely bigger than your average county fair, because of a pig. Let's slow it down. The island was suddenly full of flags and uniforms. The Americans dug trenches, set up tents. British sailors sharpened bayonets and drank tea. No one fired a shot. But both sides stood their ground. George Pickett puffed his chest and said he'd hold the island against all the British in the Pacific. British Admiral Robert Baines responded calmly. He refused to fire a single shot unless ordered directly by the Crown. Why? Because, and these are his actual words, it is not worth it to go to war over a pig. You have to admire that level of chill. So, the soldiers waited. They cooked food, cleaned rifles, watched birds, and tried not to sneeze too loudly, in case it triggered a cannon. Days passed, then weeks, then months. No battles, no bloodshed, just an incredibly awkward military sleepover. Eventually, Washington, D.C. realised this might turn into something very dumb. President James Buchanan sent someone to clean it up. That someone? General Winfield Scott, a giant of a man, literally, over 6 feet tall, wearing full military regalia and looking like he stepped out of a history painting. Scott was a veteran of many wars, but this time he came not to fight, but to soothe. He sat down with both the Americans and the British. He nodded a lot. He spoke slowly, and he suggested a solution: joint military occupation. Each side could have 100 soldiers on the island. No more. They'd build camps, but they wouldn't fight. And somehow, it worked. Just like that, two great powers agreed to share an island the size of a sleepy village. For the next 12 years, the island was home to two tiny military camps. American camp at the south end, English camp at the north. And between them, nothing but meadows, breezes, and the occasional confused sheep. The soldiers got bored, so they threw parties, played cricket and baseball, shared recipes, held theatre nights and barbecues. British officers would visit the American camp for whiskey. American soldiers would wander over to the British side for afternoon tea. It became less of a standoff and more of an extended camping trip. No gunshots, no charges, no casualties, except, of course, for the pig. Eventually, by 1872, both countries decided we should probably finish this. So they asked a neutral third party to settle the matter. Someone respected, someone distant. And who did they choose? Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. Yes, the literal Kaiser. He wasn't super invested in pig politics, but he agreed to help. His commission reviewed maps, examined treaties, and thought very hard about water channels. After a while he announced, San Juan Island belongs to the United States. And the British? They packed their things, waved politely, and left. No drama. Just tea and farewell. So what did we learn? That sometimes things escalate faster than they should. That maps matter. That vague treaties are a terrible idea. And that pigs should definitely be fenced in. Today, on San Juan Island, there's a monument. It doesn't honour a general or a president. It honours the pig. The only casualty of one of history's most polite wars. So as your eyes begin to close and your thoughts slow down, remember the pig. He didn't mean to start a war. He just wanted a snack. And because of him, two countries spent a decade watching each other awkwardly from across a meadow. Let that soothe you. Because if a pig can bring peace through potatoes, maybe your worries can wait for tomorrow. Let's stay in that cosy, drowsy headspace and drift now to another place where soldiers squared off, not over empires or treasures, but over a dog. Yes, a dog. It's October 1925. The world is still recovering from the First World War. Europe is tired, borders are shaky, nerves are frayed. Our scene shifts to a dusty stretch of the Greek-Bulgarian border near Petric, a sleepy little town nestled in the hills. It was just a normal day for the soldiers stationed there. Quiet, uneventful. But then, a dog barked. A Greek soldier's dog, to be precise. And dogs, as you may know, aren't always the best at understanding borders. This one, full of energy and curiosity, decided to run across the border into Bulgarian territory. Naturally, the soldier followed. His loyalty got the better of him, and when he crossed the invisible political line, Bulgarian guards panicked. Shots rang out. The Greek soldier was killed. Now most would say this was a tragic misunderstanding, a border patrol gone wrong. But cooler heads were not in abundance that day. The Greek military, hearing one of their men had been killed over a runaway dog, was incensed. They demanded an apology. Bulgaria said it was an unfortunate accident, but didn't offer the formal apology or compensation the Greeks wanted. So the Greek army mobilised. Yes, mobilised over one dog. Within days, Greek forces entered Bulgarian territory. They captured the border town of Petric. Gunfire echoed through the valleys. Bulgarian civilians panicked and fled. The situation escalated quickly. Bulgaria, stunned by the response, appealed to the newly formed League of Nations. Help, they essentially said. They're invading us because of a dog. The League, still trying to prove it could prevent another world war, stepped in. They urged a ceasefire. Mediators were sent. Tensions cooled, and within days the Greek troops pulled back. The League ruled in Bulgaria's favour, and Greece was ordered to pay compensation. No more shots were fired, and the stray dog, no one knows what happened to it, but somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten corner of memory, that dog is still running. Now, as your eyes feel heavier, and your body melts into the mattress, like butter on warm toast, let me tell you another story. It's another war, a fierce one with pride, ego, honour, and a bucket. Yes, a wooden bucket. Because apparently, in the 14th century, someone thought that was worth fighting over. Let's dim the torches, tiptoe back in time, and visit Italy in the year 1325. Let's set the scene slowly, softly, like parchment unrolling, across a dusty oak table. Italy back then was not one united country. It was more like a collection of family arguments that turned into towns. City-states, each with their own governments, coins, armies, and centuries of grudges. Two of these cities were Bologna and Modena. Bologna, wealthy, scholarly, known for its university, a proud city full of books, robes, and opinionated scholars. Modena, a little smaller, more working class, full of blacksmiths, farmers, and folks who'd had just about enough of Bologna's high horse. Now you may be wondering, why were they fighting? Well, they weren't just neighbours. They were also members of two opposing factions in Italian politics at the time. The Guelphs, who supported the Pope, and the Ghibellines, who supported the Holy Roman Emperor. Guess which side Bologna was on? Yep, Guelph. And Modena, Ghibelline. These two groups hated each other, like rival football teams with swords. They feuded for decades, sometimes over borders, sometimes over politics, but mostly because they were stubborn, like siblings, arguing over who gets the front seat for 200 years. Which brings us to the year 1325, and a very specific and very wooden bucket. It began, like so many things in history, with a bit of mischief. A group of Modenese soldiers, out on a raid, entered Bologna. Maybe they were bored. Maybe they were looking for supplies. Or maybe they just wanted to get under Bologna's skin. Whatever the reason, they found themselves in the city, and they stole something. Not gold, not maps, not a sacred relic. A bucket, a wooden bucket, used to draw water from a city well. It was likely old, scratched, maybe even splintered. But to the Modenese, it became a prize. They brought it home, laughing all the way. And instead of hiding it, they hung it up in their town hall, like a trophy, or a very practical prank. When Bologna found out, they were furious. They demanded their bucket back. Modena said no, and that was that. It was on, a full-blown war over a wooden bucket. Bologna, puffed up with pride, rallied its troops. According to some historical accounts, they gathered a force of over 30,000 men. That's a lot of people to fight over plumbing supplies. Modena, with far fewer soldiers, just over 7,000, prepared to defend themselves. The two armies met at a place called Zappolino. You can almost hear the clinking of armour, the neighing of horses, the grumbling of soldiers who would have preferred to be anywhere else. And as the fog lifted from the fields, battle began. You'd think the larger Bolognese force would win, right? But no. The Modenese were sharp, fast, coordinated. They used the terrain, struck decisively, and sent the Bolognese army running. It wasn't just a victory. It was a rout. Humiliating. The kind of defeat you don't live down easily. And to make matters worse, as the Bolognese army retreated, the Modenese soldiers mocked them by banging on buckets. True story. Mockery by cookware. History's most passive-aggressive soundtrack. So what happened to the bucket? Did they return it? Of course not. They kept it. And more than 700 years later, it's still in Modena. Today, it's displayed in a museum. There it sits. This unremarkable wooden bucket, elevated by time, absurdity, and stubbornness. You can visit it. People do. They stand there, staring at a bucket that launched a war that claimed lives, drained treasuries, and changed nothing, except the ownership of one piece of medieval plumbing. Now, as the tale winds down and your breathing deepens, what do we make of the War of the Bucket? Is it a story about pride? Certainly. About how even great cities can fall into petty squabbles if they let emotion lead. It's about the symbols we cling to, even when they're made of wood. And maybe, just maybe, it's about how ridiculous we humans can be. But also, how strangely poetic. Because that bucket, still being there, quietly waiting in a museum, is almost like a bedtime story itself. A reminder that history isn't always about kings and castles. Sometimes it's about something much dumber and much more relaxing. And now, as your eyelids sink just a little heavier, let me tell you, one more tale. It's about hats and pins and the women who weaponized fashion. But we'll get to that in a moment. Just breathe in and let the bucket rest. Let's keep going. One more conflict, This one includes birds. Big ones, fast ones, feathered ones. We now float, gently, down under, to the vast, dusty interior of Western Australia. It's 1932. The Great Depression has hit. Times are tough. And the Australian government is about to go to war with emus. Yes, emus. Large, flightless birds, kind of like ostriches, but with less grace and more attitude. Here's how it happened. After World War I, many Australian soldiers returned home. The government, in its wisdom, offered them land in Western Australia to farm. The only problem? The land was terrible, dry, hard to irrigate, and not particularly bountiful. Still, the veterans did their best. They planted crops, they tilled the soil, they waited for rain. And then came the amuse. Tens of thousands of them. You see, amuse migrate seasonally. And that year, they discovered that wheat fields were a lot more appealing than dry grasslands. The birds descended like a fluffy, chaotic army. They trampled fences, ate grain, knocked over equipment, and they were fast. Amuse can run up to 30 miles per hour. Farmers were helpless, so they called the government and said essentially, help, the birds are winning. Enter the Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce. He listened, he sympathised, and he approved. A military solution. Troops would be sent. Machine guns to fight the amuse. So in November 1932, Major G.P.W. Meredith and 2 soldiers were deployed to Western Australia. They had 2 Lewis guns, British-made, air-cooled machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Their mission? Eradicate the emu menace. It did not go well. The emus were elusive. They travelled in small, quick groups. The soldiers would set up their guns, only for the birds to scatter before they could fire. In one attempt, they mounted a gun on a truck. The truck couldn't keep up with the emus. The ride was bumpy. The gun jammed. They shot and missed, over and over. At one point, Meredith observed that emus had remarkable evasive abilities. He said, and I quote, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world." The soldiers eventually claimed they'd killed about 1,000 emus, but estimates suggest there were at least 20,000 in the area. The birds won. The operation was halted. The press mocked the entire effort. One headline read, "Emus defeats soldiers." Later, farmers asked for another campaign. The government said no. Instead, they offered bounties. And so ended the Great Emu War. No land was lost. No treaties were signed. Just a lot of feathers. And a warning. Never underestimate birds with long legs and longer grudges. It's the year 1731. The seas of the Caribbean are alive with the sound of waves and cannon fire. Spain and Britain are tense. Their merchants crisscross the ocean. Their navies patrol the waters. Their smugglers smuggle. And in the middle of all this is a man named Robert Jenkins. He was a British merchant captain, sailed small ships, carried cargo between England and the West Indies. But one day, Spanish coast guards stopped his vessel. They accused him of smuggling. A scuffle broke out. And during the confrontation, a Spanish officer drew his sword and cut off Jenkins' ear. Clean off. Accounts vary. Some say they gave the ear back to him. Others say they just mocked him and let him go. But either way, Jenkins returned to Britain, minus one ear. And he was angry. For a few years no one paid much attention. But in 1738, as tensions rose again between Britain and Spain, Jenkins was called to testify before Parliament. And there, according to legend, he pulled out a small jar. Inside it was his severed ear. He held it aloft and said essentially, "This is what they did to me." The room was shocked. Emotions ran high. Newspapers ran with the story. And within months, Britain declared war on Spain over Jenkins' ear. Now, to be fair, there were other reasons. Control of trade routes, colonial competition. But it was the ear that captured imaginations. The war began in 1739. It mostly took place in the Caribbean. There were naval battles, sieges of Spanish forts, British attempts to seize ports in Florida and Colombia. Some went well, many did not. In one campaign, Admiral Edward Vernon captured the Spanish town of Portobello, boosting morale. He was hailed as a hero, but then the British tried to take Cartagena in modern-day Colombia. They sent a huge fleet, dozens of ships, thousands of men. It was a disaster. Tropical diseases like yellow fever tore through the ranks. The siege failed. The British limped home. The war dragged on, and eventually merged into the larger war of the Austrian succession. By 1748, it ended in a general peace. And Jenkins? He faded from the spotlight. His ear became history, literally. Today, you can visit the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England. They have exhibits on Jenkins's ear. And whether or not the ear in the jar ever existed, the war is remembered as one of the most oddly named conflicts in history. We're almost there. Just one last sleepy drift across history's weirder waters. Let's go somewhere tiny, like really tiny. We end in the heart of Europe, not in a battlefield, but in a very polite disagreement. It's the mid-1800s. The major European powers are tired. Napoleon is long gone. His wild ambitions scattered like cannon smoke. But his legacy left a jigsaw puzzle of borders, alliances, and fragile egos. And in the centre of it all sat Luxembourg, a picturesque little Grand Duchy. Not quite France, not quite Germany, but strategic, scenic, and, unfortunately, caught between giants. At the time, Luxembourg was ruled by the King of the Netherlands, but it also had strong ties to the German Confederation, especially Prussia. To top it off, a large Prussian military garrison still sat in the fortress, in the capital city of Luxembourg, one of the most heavily fortified places in Europe. It was like a medieval castle, with modern cannons. France didn't like that. Napoleon III, nephew of the original Napoleon, was running the show in France. He had a moustache, he had ambition, and he wanted Luxembourg. Why? Well, partly because it was close, and partly because he wanted to expand French influence without causing too much of a fuss. He saw a chance. The King of the Netherlands, Wilhelm III, was strapped for cash. And Napoleon thought, what if I just bought Luxembourg? Sounds simple, right? Offer money, get a signature, pack up the Prussian troops. Boom. New French territory. But when the deal started circulating, leaked, whispered, and hinted, it set off alarm bells in Berlin. You see, Prussia had just unified most of northern Germany under its leadership, and Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, was watching France like a hawk. To Bismarck, the sale of Luxembourg wasn't just real estate. It was a test. If France took Luxembourg, what would stop them from eyeing Belgium? Or the Rhineland? Suddenly the whole continent felt a breeze tension. Newspapers speculated war was imminent. Troop movements were watched with binoculars. And so, in 1867, the Luxembourg crisis became, well, a crisis, but not a war. Why? Because nobody wanted one. Not really. Everyone had too much to lose. So, in classic 19th century European fashion, they held a conference in London. The great powers all showed up. Britain, France, Prussia, Austria, and others. And they talked. And talked. Now as your eyes grow heavier and your mind drifts even slower, I want to return, not to conflict, but to thought. Tonight, you've heard stories of humans behaving strangely, but beautifully too. Stories of flags and pride, of buckets and pigs, of hats turned weapons. So let's slowly wander back through the meadows of these tales and reflect without rush on what they really mean. Let's start with the pig. The pig war, as silly as it sounds, was not really about a pig. The pig, poor thing, was just hungry. But hunger is such a powerful thing, isn't it? The creature, wanting food, started a sequence of diplomatic dominoes that nearly brought two empires to war. And yet, because humans on both sides chose patience over pride, it never did. They chose to build camps instead of trenches, to brew tea instead of spilling blood, to trade songs and baseball games instead of artillery shells. And for 12 years, two military forces just lived side by side, peacefully. Bored, perhaps, but safe. It reminds us that sometimes doing nothing at all is a powerful decision. That not reacting, especially in the fog of frustration, is a kind of wisdom. And in that stillness, there's something deeply human. But then, there's the bucket. Ah yes, the war of the bucket. A fine wooden pail, hoisted from a well, carried off in a moment of opportunistic mischief. And suddenly, Italian city-states go to battle. It's hard not to smile at the idea. A bucket, after all, is such a humble thing. Something used to carry water, or grain, or perhaps olives, if you want to lean into the Italian imagery. And yet, people died over it. What does that tell us? It tells us that symbols, no matter how small, can become lightning rods for much larger tensions. Modena and Bologna were already uneasy neighbours. The bucket was just the spark. Pride did the rest. Sometimes, when people feel insulted, even a wooden bucket can become a banner of defiance or revenge. That's something we can all relate to, can't we? That small, everyday misunderstandings, if left unresolved, can fester. They can escalate. They can lead to shouting, or silence, or wars with banners and horses. We're reminded, maybe the bucket isn't the real issue. Maybe it never was. And then, there's the hats. The hatpin riots. It may sound like a comedy of fashion gone rogue, but it wasn't comedy to the women who lived through it. These weren't just protests about accessories. They were skirmishes in the long, weary war for independence, dignity, safety. A woman alone in the 1900s, America had few weapons. Her words weren't always heard. Her choices were often questioned. Her movements limited. So she carried what she could, and that happened to be a sharp metal pin, long enough to fasten a hat, and to defend a life. The riots weren't about hats. They were about harassment, and the right to walk freely, to ride streetcars alone, to be unbothered. It's a reminder that when people aren't protected, they'll find their own way, even if that way involves 20 inches of steel, tucked behind a brim. Each of these stories, whether wrapped in pigskin, wood grain, or velvet, speak to something deeper in us. Our need for respect, our resistance to being laughed at, stepped on, or ignored, and our surprising ability to escalate the smallest things into headline history. Now, as your breathing slows and the stories start to blur in that soft space between waking and dreams, let's wander deeper into these thoughts. Let's meander through the forest of meaning without needing to arrive anywhere. Let's pause here. Let's go slower still. Take the pig war again. Imagine being Lyman Cutler, just a farmer trying to protect your potatoes. You didn't ask for international scrutiny. You didn't expect soldiers, or flags, or boats full of redcoats appearing on the horizon. You just didn't want a pig to eat your crop. It's funny. And yet, how often in life do we see this pattern? Something small happens, a disagreement over land, or a tone of voice, or an email sent too fast, and before long, others are pulled in. Sides form, lines harden. What was once about a pig, or a bucket, or a hat pin, becomes about something else entirely. Identity, territory, pride. It's no accident that George Pickett, eager to prove himself, jumped at the chance to raise the flag and claim the island. Ego often disguises itself as patriotism, and that's not a criticism, it's a caution. Because when we elevate every moment into a matter of honour, we forget to ask if it was really worth it. Let's visit Modena again, in the year 1325. Knights in polished armour, banners fluttering, men sharpening swords, preparing for a real war. Over a bucket, a wooden trophy taken from a well, like children grabbing souvenirs from a playground. Did they really care about the bucket? Or did they care about being seen as weak, being mocked? It's the same reason schoolyard fights erupt over name-calling. It's not the insult itself. It's the fear of appearing small. Modena won that war, and they kept the bucket as a prize. It still hangs in their city to this day. A bucket, protected like a relic, visited like a saint, treated not as a joke, but a badge of defiance. Because once something causes enough damage, it becomes sacred, even if it's just made of wood. And then there are the hat pins, so simple, so sharp. They were functional before they were political. But when the world around women refused to give them space, those humble pins became declarations. We will not be touched. It's fascinating, isn't it? How objects, ordinary ones, can become powerful when tied to a cause. The hat pin is no longer just a fashion item. It's a line in the sand. A woman with a hat pin wasn't looking for trouble. She was trying to make sure trouble didn't find her. And when laws were proposed, to ban them, to make them shorter, to make women vulnerable again, the pushback came hard. Because control, once tasted, is not given up easily. These stories remind us that history is not just grand battles and thundering speeches. Sometimes it's awkward, petty, funny, infuriating, and deeply, deeply human. Just like us. Now, as you settle even deeper into stillness, your blanket rising and falling with each breath, let's think about the absurdity of how often our world turns on such small things. Not giant declarations, not invasions, not revolutions, but buckets, boars, and brooches. The pig war showed us what happens when no one really wants to be the one to back down. It's not that either side wanted to shoot. They just didn't want to be the first to admit this whole thing. It didn't really matter. There's a quiet dignity in what came next. Forts built, not to attack, but to wait. Soldiers who gardened more than they marched, who played cricket with their enemies. And in that patience, a lesson. You don't have to win every argument. You don't have to make your point louder than the other side. You can just be, just live, near each other, as quietly as fog over a harbour. Even now, that island carries the memory of calm. San Juan is a peaceful place. There's a park. There's a marker. There's no pig. But there is a legacy. A peaceful waiting. And then there's Modena, where victory over Bologna is still celebrated with a wooden bucket. They laugh now, of course. They must. Because time does that. It smooths over the sharp edges of our past. But there's something poetic there too. Because the bucket wasn't just a trophy. It became a symbol of stubbornness, of small-town pride. Sometimes we forget history isn't written by the victors, it's written by the ones who build museums. And in Modena, they built one around a bucket. There's pride in the petty. And sometimes there's healing in humour. If you can laugh at the past, you're free from it. Finally, the hatpin riots remind us that while some conflicts may begin in laughter, they often end in tears. Because not all ridiculous things are trivial. A woman defending herself with a pin may seem quaint from afar, but from up close, it's survival. Every woman riding a trolley alone, every teen walking home, every stranger trying not to be followed, those stories still echo today. The pins may be gone, but the fear, still real. And what about the outrage? The way authorities responded? Men in power don't always like it when their assumptions are challenged. And a woman carrying a tiny piece of steel? That was more than metal. It was a threat to the way things were. So they called for laws, hatpin bans, restrictions, reductions. But you can't legislate. Away fear. You can't ask someone to be unarmed while leaving them unprotected. And that's why women fought back. Why the newspapers reported the riots. Why they stood their ground, pin in hand, chin raised. Because sometimes a point needs to be made. Now, as your breath becomes slower, your limbs heavier, and the blanket of sleep begins to draw over your thoughts like a fog over the San Juan coast. Let's gather these stories one last time. The pig war, the war of the bucket, the hatpin riots. Three events separated by centuries, continents and cultures, but tied together by something almost embarrassingly simple. How very human we all are. In every conflict, we see people who are trying to do the right thing by their own lights. Lyman Cutler just wanted to grow potatoes in peace. Charles Griffin just wanted to let his pig be free. Captain Pickett wanted to prove himself. British commanders wanted to avoid a war. General Winfield Scott just wanted everyone to calm down and take a deep breath. And then in Italy, the Modernist soldiers wanted their pride back. The Bolognese defenders wanted their city respected. All over a bucket, but really over dignity. And in the United States, the women holding those hatpins weren't looking for fights. They were looking for safety, for equality, for a say in their own lives. And when society laughed or punished them for their strength, they didn't back down. They sharpen their resolve, and they're accessories. You see, the grand sweep of history isn't always about kings or revolutions or famous declarations. Sometimes it's quieter, more mundane, more ridiculous, and more revealing. Because in the dumbest of conflicts, we often find the deepest truths. That ego is fragile, that pride, once wounded, can cause chaos, that power doesn't like to be poked, and that sometimes the world changes because one person got fed up over a pig or a hat pin or a wooden bucket hanging in a well. And that's why we tell these stories. Slowly, gently, sleepily. Not because they're footnotes, but because they're windows into who we are and who we've always been. So, as your body rests and your mind drifts somewhere between then and now, remember this. Every silly story has weight. Every absurd war had consequences. And every time someone stood their ground over livestock or laundry or liberty, they nudged the world a little closer to something new, something fairer, something funnier, and perhaps something kinder. Now close your eyes, let the last thoughts fade, and dream of absurd battles that never quite were, over buckets, over boars, over brooches. Sleep well.